Spelling note. Ancient names appear in many forms across sources. Some listeners will find Gaia written as Gia, Cronus as Cronus, Demeter as Deita. In this telling, I use the familiar classical spellings while honoring those variants as part of the tradition. You think Greek myths are just stories to hush a child to sleep? You think they're soft fables, pretty ornaments for the imagination, tales to be read in passing, pretty as lullabies. But listen, beneath every lullaby here is a hand that steadies the world, a map that teaches people how to live, and a language that names a fear so it can be born. Tonight, we will pull the bedclothes back and find the world those stories were trying to hold together. If you want more myth deep dives like this, subscribe. Close your eyes for a moment and feel the world before words, if a world can be said to have a before. Imagine a dark without margin, a silence that is not quiet but pregnant, a void that holds a kind of restless potential. The ancients called it chaos, not as a synonym for disorder so much as a throat, an opening from which things would speak. Out of that opening rose the first great presence, Gaia, the living earth, broad and patient as a waiting heart. From Gaia's vast back came another presence, Uranus, the sky, a dome of breath that pressed upon the earth, cool and distant, a lover who both embraces and smothers. This is the cosmogonic image, earth and sky locked in an embrace that makes life possible and also keeps something down. Between their bodies, the first generation takes shape. Titans and giants and children of a magnitude we cannot imagine. Some are beautiful, some are monstrous. Cyclopses with a single eye like a polished coin, 100-handers whose many arms were a rumor of storms. Creation here is not genteel. It is a messy weaving of tenderness and violence, of begetting and binding. What this story told them? Origin stories like this function as an attempt to explain how order could arise from unformed potential. The image of earth pressed to sky yields a practical lesson. Things that make life are also the things that can stifle it. The same embrace that allows crops to grow can flatten a seed. For agrarian people, the world is an active presence, with moods. Myths let them talk to those moods. Uranus, the sky, loved control more than he loved nurture. He feared the power that generation held, and, in a gesture both domineering and terrified, he hid some of his children away, cast them into Tartarus, a deep, cold hollow beneath the world's foundation. The Cyclopses, with their singular hammering eye, were hurled down. The 100-handers were bound. Gaia felt this as an insult born under her skin. Her children were taken into the dark where roots could not reach them. So she turned to the only weapon she had that could answer Sky's cruelty, prophecy and cunning. Enter Cronus, the Titan who would become both agent and symptom of a particular kind of rule. Imagine him, small in the shadow of Gaia and Uranus, but quick and full of appetite. Gaia, angry and grieving, fashioned a sickle of bronze and gave it to Cronus. The act that follows is not simply a revenge tale, it is a myth of succession with teeth. Cronus ambushed Uranus, severed his power, and by that violent cut unsealed the world's next regime. Blood spilled into the sea, and from that sea, from its foam and the mingled essences of sky and sea, Aphrodite is born, beauty emerging from wound. Grosser births follow, the Furies, the giants, the chthonic things that will haunt the grooves of memory. What this story functions to do? It explains a recurring observation in human polities. New rulers often arise by cutting away an old order. It encodes a cultural acceptance of violent transfer as one possible logic of power, and it gives form to the ancient fear that creation is inseparable from pain. Myth here says, mouth gently closed, the world as we know it is made through rupture. Cronus takes the throne. At first, his reign looks like stability, a mantle taken, a new order imposed. But stability born of fear is brittle. Cronus learns the language of prophecy, and prophecies are parasites on power. He hears a rumor, or rather a prediction, that one of his children will overthrow him just as he overthrew his father. To prevent the future, to stop the inevitable tilt of crowns, Cronus commits to the grotesque calculus of preemptive control. He swallows each child whole at birth. Picture the palace, the midwives' songs choked off. Rhea, his sister and consort, gives birth to Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, and one by one they vanish inside Cronus. The image is terrifying, but not voyeuristic. Rather, it crystallizes an idea. Power built on swallowing is devouring its own future. Rhea cannot bear it. What she needs is a trick that will both save a child and teach a lesson about the limits of a tyrant's grasp. So when she is pregnant once more, she hides an infant in a cave on a remote island, slips a stone, wrapped and swaddled, in Cronus's hands and lets him believe the cycle is complete. That stone is at once a literal object and a symbol, the substitute, the misdirection that allows history to keep turning. This is the moment we meet Zeus. Imagine the child in that cave, a god cast in secret. The stories place him among nymphs, suckled by a goat named Amalthea, sheltered by sound dancers, maidens whose drums and songs muffled the baby's cries. His upbringing is at once humble and otherworldly, nourishers not of a king's court, but of the wild and the underground. That secrecy is crucial. It gives Zeus a perspective not permitted to a ruler raised in a throne room. He learns of the people of the earth and the ways of their songs. He learns to listen. What this story meant for the ancients? The secret upbringing motif shows that legitimacy can be born outside aristocratic structures.
Rulers who experience the world rather than only ordering it carry different obligations. Zeus is not purely usurper. He is both product and critic of succession. Zeus grows, and with growth comes cunning. Some tales insist he took Metis, the goddess of cunning, as a counselor. Others dwell on a trick. At last, when Cronus grows complacent, Zeus offers a potion designed to make the old Titan disgorge what he has swallowed. One by one, the children return to light, blinking and bewildered, and the stone is spat forth to be set upon a pedestal. The table is reset. The swallowed become allies. The son who was hidden becomes the leader of a new coalition. There is tenderness in this act and ferocity. It reveals a new logic of rule, not only force, but an ability to reassemble a lineage shattered by paranoia. Yet the story is careful to show that even a liberator can inherit the language of control. Zeus is at once liberator and further usurper. It is a moral ambivalence the myths delight in. The hero frees his kin, but then he must take up the weapons and mantle of power, for power does not hand itself over politely. Now the stage is set for the Titanomachy, the 10-year war that will decide which logic holds sway, the ancient, earth-rooted tyranny, or the younger, sky-promising order. For a long time, tellers linger on the preparations. Zeus goes to Tartarus, the deep prison where the Cyclopses and the Hundred-Handers would then confined, victims of Uranus's fear. He listens to their grievances, learns the rattle of their bound hands like imprisoned thunder. There is an exchange, freedom for craft, chains for loyalty. The Cyclopses, grateful, forge gifts that are not mere objects, but declarations of cosmic authority. A thunderbolt, forged of lightning and cunning. A trident for Poseidon, carved from the very logic of the sea. A helm for Hades that grants the bearer a fearsome, impenetrable presence. These gifts are more than tools. They are metaphors for practical technologies of rule. What this myth functions to do, by narrating the forging of weapons, the story encodes the idea that new regimes legitimize themselves by producing things, institutions, craft, usable knowledge, unavailable under the old order. The thunderbolt becomes a story form for the suddenness and decisiveness of law. The trident names a ruler's capacity to shape that which is restless and dangerous. The helm grants invisibility, the secret knowledge of how to remain apart while still being sovereign. The war itself is vast in mythic scope. Chariots of sky against the bulk of titanic bodies, mountain shearing blows, the ground trembling like a drum. I ask you to imagine not only the clamor but the symbolic register. The battle is generational. In every culture, the young accuse the old of calcification. The old accuse the young of hubris. Here it is writ in thunder and bronze. For 10 seasons the armies clash, and in the end the new gods prevail.
The Titans are cast down, not entirely destroyed, but consigned to a subterranean jurisdiction, imprisoned, bound again. Order is reconstituted with a different logic, the rule of Olympians. Pause on this. The Titanomachy is not an endorsement of violence. Rather, what this story functions to do is to give narrative weight to historical shifts that might otherwise be mysterious or chaotic. It provides a grammar for enormous social reconfigurations, how a city reorganizes, how a new priesthood takes advantage of ritual, how a different class consolidates power. People who heard these stories could map their own upheavals onto a cosmic scale and thereby find patterns in what otherwise felt arbitrary. Yet, the victory of Zeus is not the last word. Gaia, the earth that birthed both tyrants and liberators, nurtures an ambivalence that will not be satisfied. Angry and bereft of sons, she births one final outrage, Typhon, the serpent of storms, a thing enormous and filthy with smoke, whose heads are many and breathes fire like a furnace. Typhon is the world's memory asserting itself, an eruption of the deep, a volcanic answer to the arrogance of the sky. The fight between Zeus and Typhon is cataclysmic because it is elemental. Imagine a mountain split open, a cloud of brimstone, the sea reaching for the earth to quench a fever it cannot. In some tellings, Typhon is hurled beneath Mount Etna, where the earth's anger continues to mumble and steam. In others, he is chained at the world's edge. Either way, the myth keeps an important residue. The gods can wage war and yet remain vulnerable to the planet's own moods. Even kings must reckon with forces beyond their making. What this story told them, Typhon's myth functions to explain geological phenomena, volcanoes, earthquakes, storms, by personifying them, making the catastrophe a being to name and remember. Doing so transforms terror into language and language into ritual. If Mount Etna rumbles, people light a sacrifice and tell a story. The story organizes fear and prescribes a communal response. After Typhon, the narrative turns to the division of realms. Lots are drawn, crowns set upon new heads. Zeus takes the sky and the mantle of kingship. Poseidon draws the sea, capricious and deep. Hades takes the subterranean realm, a kingdom of shades and stores. These divisions are not arbitrary. They are a cosmology that parallels social organization. The sky houses kings and law. The sea contains merchants, sailors, those who cross boundaries. The underworld contains the dead, debts, and memory. What this story functions to do, dividing the cosmos into spheres, mirrors the human division of labor and responsibility. It makes a map where each domain has its duties, its rituals, and its taboos. People could then voice expectations: who judges, who punishes, who protects, through the personhood of a god. For now, however, let us stay with the newly crowned young regime. Zeus sits on his throne, but the throne is not a static object. It is a mantle that needs to be worn and articulated. His rule will be less a monolith than a conversation between gods and humans, between the needs of institutions and the temper of the earth. You begin to see the pattern. These are not stories of whimsy. They are specifications, blueprints couched as drama. They answer the small, pressing questions of any culture. Why does the season change? Why do kings fear being unseated? Why does the earth sometimes shake? Who is responsible for justice, for marriage, for grain? The answer is woven into a single fabric of tales that were told, retold, and ritualized. Now imagine the palace in the New Age. The Olympians arrange themselves, each choosing or being assigned domains that will rhyme with human life. They are not merely characters, they are roles, archetypes given faces and mannerisms. The jealous queen, the cunning craftsman, the armored war god who loves nothing so much as the thrill of battle. The stories about them become the way people learn what each role expects and forbids. We will dwell later on portraits of each major deity, but for now, notice how the narrative keeps giving double images. The gods are both cosmic explanations and social templates. A single tale might explain thunder and also teach the virtue of hospitality. A single goddess might explain the harvest and also define what it means to be a mourning mother. Before we reach those neat galleries, there is a quieter scene that often slips by in grand retellings: the moment of forging and gift. In the dim cave where the Cyclopes hammer, the thunderbolt is born. The sound is not only metal on metal, it is the sound of a community convincing itself that new tools can shift power. The Cyclopes, once bound and feared, become indispensable. Their craft is a lesson. Knowledge and skill can be a kind of redemption. It is an exchange of agency. What this myth tells them practically: technological or ritual innovations provide new legitimacy. Whoever controls the ritual objects controls symbolic power. In the same way a modern state legitimizes itself through monuments or institutions, the old world tells its story through forged lightning. And yet, while we speak of forging as a metaphor for statecraft, the myths never let us forget the body of the earth. Those who listen closely will sense that every political image is shadowed by a geological one. When Zeus throws a bolt, a storm answers. When ships are broken on Poseidon's will, men die in a very physical, very public way. The myth keeps both images close to one another, so that policy and weather, law and soil become part of the same conversation. Now, a quieter but no less important thread winds through this tapestry. Rhea's grief and the hidden child formed a personal drama that opens onto a public principle. The trick that saved Zeus was intimate, domestic, even furtive. We sometimes forget that the grand gestures of history are made in kitchens, caves, and by women whose cunning is often the decisive factor. Myth remembers. Think too about the figure of Metis, the cunning. The Greeks were enamored of wisdom as strategy, not abstract philosophy alone, but practical intelligence that knows how to turn a problem. The ancient telling imbues governance with this quality. Rule must be forceful enough to be effective and subtle enough to be survivable. The mythos interplay of trick and strength is a corrective to any simple triumphalist reading. New regimes need trickery as much as they need valor. We can already hear the first murmurs of the Titanomachy. The freed children rally beneath Zeus. There is planning, counsel, and the deep, improbable solidarity of those who suffered under swallowing. The plans are spy-like. Who will hold the line? Who will bring the chariots? Where will the giants be needed? In these tactical scenes, notice how the myth translates warfare into moral economy. Who owes what to whom, and how debt is repaid in favors and forged gifts. What this story functions to do for society, it models coalition building. In times of upheaval, disparate groups, once imprisoned or marginalized, may be the ones who redraw the map. The Cyclopes' gift is a metaphor for the political bargain. Craftsmen and laborers exchange their skills for recognition. Their craft legitimizes the new order, while the new order grants them place and voice. Before the first clash of arms, before shields meet, there is a lull. In that hush, the ancient storytellers put in small lessons. Oaths are sworn, omens read, sacrifices made. Rituals anchor action in meaning. They are the cultural breaks that prevent violence from becoming mere chaos. Sacrifice is not only blood, but social grammar. The act signals commitment. It is a public remark that the cause has community backing. Now the cloud bursts and the war begins, but not in our telling just yet. Let us instead follow one lesser traced thread that winds out of the Titanomachy and will bring us back to the human scale. The story of Prometheus, the trickster who will later approach mankind with fire. Prometheus is not merely a clever titan. He is a figure who crosses the boundary between divine craft and human need. Some tales have him shape humans from clay and breathe into them an unsettled intelligence. Others give him the role of a mediator who tricks the gods to favor humans. In one famous tale, Prometheus divides a sacrificial ox in two ways. One portion wrapped in appealing fat and skin hiding bone, the other portion the meat itself, ugly but the true gift. He tricks Zeus into accepting the deceptive portion as the people's share, thus reserving the better meat for humankind. This story is less about culinary deception than about ritual rites. It questions who receives the benefits of sacrifice.
And then he steals fire from the gods, literally a lamp against the dark, and gives it to humans. Fire, of course, is technology, and the myth says aloud what practical peoples know. With new tools comes political risk. Zeus punishes Prometheus for this theft, not because he fears fire itself, but because he fears the redistribution of power that fire symbolizes. The punishment is severe. Prometheus is bound where eagles devour his liver daily. The cruelty is meant to show consequences, but also to remind listeners that gifts to humanity often provoke the gods' wrath. What this myth functions to do, it explains the origin of arts and crafts while embedding the moral tension of progress. The story rationalizes why new knowledge can be dangerous, both to the innovator and to the cosmic order, and therefore why societies must ritualize the costs of advancement. Prometheus becomes a narrative shorthand for the inventor, the rebel, the one who moves a people forward at great personal expense. The Pandora episode complements Prometheus. Where Prometheus opens possibility for humans, Pandora opens the box of misfortune and hope. Zeus gives Pandora as a gift and curse to humanity, and with her box released evils upon the world. Yet hope remains inside. The myth offers a complex diagnosis. Life is a mix of toil and consolation. The story functions to explain why life is hard and why humans still cling to optimism. It is a moral architecture for suffering. Such stories, Prometheus's theft, Pandora's jar, are not quaint origin tales. They form an ethical register. They instruct communities about innovation and its costs, about who bears suffering, and about consolation in the midst of hardship. We are now poised between the grand cosmic battles and the domestic, mortal stories that teach ritual and law. The narrative has moved from the thunder of divine conflict into the quieter moral theater of provision, ritual, and human suffering. Yet the tension is far from resolved. Crowds gather, banners tremble. The Cyclops' forges cool only to heat again. The sea waits, restless. And overhead, the new order breathes. Zeus, sitting on his throne, looks to the horizon. He must decide how to govern, not just by force, but by law and by example. He must recognize that power must be narrated to be stable. That is why myths often turn immediately from cosmic origins to portraits of the gods themselves. Once you know who the gods are, you know how to behave. Learning the god of war's temper is learning when to avoid battle. Knowing the goddess of harvest's grief is to know how to honor the seasons. We will come back to those portraits. For now, the preparatory scenes close on a quiet image. Zeus walking among the olive trees, Poseidon unfurling his hands over the sea, Rhea turning to the earth to listen for its whispers. The world hums with possibility and with dread. The stakes are clear, not only for immortal hearsay, but for those who live in mud-brick houses below. The winner of the coming conflict will shape the rights they must keep, the crops they shall tend, the songs their children will inherit. This is the reality that myths were doing, translating cosmic upheaval into social policies and private convictions. At the edge of this moment, there is still one more figure to consider, less glorious in battle but crucial in household life: Demeter, whose grief for her daughter will become the engine for agrarian rights. Even now, as the war drums beat, Demeter's future sorrow is hinted at in the earth's changing face: fields bright, then barren. The mythworks foreshadow ritual cycles. They tell farmers what to expect and how to ritually cope when the world turns stingy. And there is Hera, whose jealousy will become law about marriage and female honor. There is Hephaestus, whose crafts will cement the practical world into being. And there is Athena, whose birth from Zeus's head will be a symbol of strategy applied to cities. Each of these figures will, in their portraits, answer the question: how should a person comport themselves in a world ruled by these forces? But for now, the last hush before the first trumpet is where we stop. Here, where the hidden child has become a leader, where the forged thunderbolt sits within reach, where the Cyclopes pace like new allies freed from chains. The clouds of battle gather, and the earth itself remembers the taste of blood, and the way it gives rise to new creatures: Aphrodite from sea foam, Furies from blood. Creation and violence remain braided. In the quiet that follows, the listener hears more than narrative detail. They hear instruction. The myth teaches prudence and suspicion toward those who swallow the future, counsels reverence for the earth, and recognizes that no ruler, however luminous, governs without debt, to craftsmen, to rituals, to the planet. There will be much more to tell: the full sweep of the Titanomachy, the portrait gallery of the Olympians, the domestic tales of Prometheus and Pandora, the rituals of Demeter and Persephone that teach how to live within an uncertain seasonal world. For now, the stage is set. The hidden child stands with the thunderbolt on the horizon, and the world waits to see whether the younger gods will make a gentler order or simply repeat the old pattern in new clothes. Listen closely for the first clash. It will decide not only who commands Olympus, but which narratives will shape how people wake each morning, and which stories will rock them to sleep. The clouds at last break. Horns answer like a distant tide. Shields catch a sky that is already writing its own story with light. The Titanomachy opens, not as a single tidy battle, but as a procession of moments that together form an epic grammar. Sieges of mountains, chasms opened like mouths, the groaning of ancient stone. Remember the Cyclopes in their forges? Their freed hands now ring with purpose. Imagine lightning braided with hammer sparks. Imagine the sea answering in salt spray. Imagine, too, the scale. No single village or king could grasp it. Only the whole of a people's imagination could hold such a scene. Zeus rides into the fight not as a glowing, solitary hero, but as the head of a coalition. Gods with grudges, giants with grudges, beings who have been kept out of the sun. The first clashes are close and noisy. Titans are not vague forces, they are bodies that fold and break like cliffs. The earth itself seems to take sides. Roots tug, subterranean fissures cough dust. There are moments of strategic cunning, Zeus using the new weapons to split a line, Poseidon using his trident to break a sea of chariot wheels, and moments of terrible endurance, the 100-handers hurling themselves forward, a human metaphor made monstrous, hands like waves thrown against cliff face. What this story functions to do? The war narrative gives people a way to think about protracted social conflict. It is not simply battle scene spectacle. It encodes the labor, cost, and alliance-making necessary for radical change. The 10-year war maps what transitions feel like when they are long and exhaustion-filled. Attrition, negotiation, bargains, and the slow building of legitimacy. There are turning points. One of them is the moment the Cyclopes hurl crafted thunderbolts skyward. Lightning in mythic imagination is not a mere weather event. It is an instrument of authority given shape. When Zeus wields it, the narrative insists authority can be decisive and terrifying, but also grounded in communal craft. Another turning point is when allies once bound now carry the weight of victory. The giants who once lay in Earth's shadow now stride in the open and demand acknowledgement. Victory has its costs. Those freed often expect recompense, and recompense must be given on terms that do not simply replace one tyranny with another. There are scenes in which the Titans are flung into the deep or bound beneath newly made caverns. And in other versions they remain, smoldering at the borders of the human world. The narrative does not celebrate simple annihilation. It insists on containment, on a geography of power that places limits on violence while recognizing its reality. Freedom in the telling is never absolute, only ordered. The new regime must erect temples as much as it must define boundaries. And so the Olympian order is stitched into being. Temples are constructed, rituals are codified. Priests develop liturgies in which the thunderbolt is invoked and the sea's temper placated. The Cyclops' gifts are displayed not just as trophies, but as symbols placed in the center of city-states. Through such public ritual, the myths do what they do best. They turn political shifts into shared, repeatable acts.
These acts, sacrifice, oath, festival, become the scaffolding on which law and community rest. What this story told them: when regimes change, people need narratives that make new duties believable. Myths supply those narratives. They explain why certain families hold priesthoods, why some craftsmen become honored, why the rights of kings carry weight. The story of the Titanomachy is a story about institutional birth as much as it is a war story. There is, however, always risk that a new order will reproduce the old patterns. The myths are attentive to that risk. Many scenes after the war depict disputes among the gods, jealousies, rivalries, bargains that appear petty next to the violence of the battlefield, and yet are profoundly instructive. They mirror the way new political actors squabble over spoils and create hierarchies. Zeus's rulership is tested not only by external threats, but by domestic frictions. Hera's watchful jealousy, Athena's exacting standards, Poseidon's occasional fits of fury. These interpersonal dramas function as microcosms for civic dynamics. If the gods show temper, so shall mortals remember to check theirs. And then there is the coda to that cosmic arc, the last monstrous uprising, the birth of Typhon. Gaia's final assault is not a random afterthought. It is a narrative insistence that the earth will not be quieted. Typhon arrives as a ruinous force, not because the gods forgot to enforce law, but because the planet keeps its own ledger. When the sky grows proud, the earth remembers. Mountains smoke, seas roar, fissures widen. Typhon's birth is the story's way of saying, rule is always provisional. The world keeps rights the gods must honor or fear. In some versions, Typhon is subdued and buried under a mountain, and certain eruptions are read as his restless shifting. The myth functions, plain and useful, as an explanation for seismic upheaval. More than that, it gives communities a ritual practice. When the mountain groans, they light offerings and tell a tale. The tale and the offering turn natural violence into social action. They create a community response that reduces terror by making it shared. When the dust settles and the gods have drawn lots for their spheres, the world gains a new map. Zeus in the sky becomes the public face of kingship and law. Poseidon, with his trident, becomes patron of sailors, storms, and the boundary crossings of commerce. Hades, often misunderstood in later receptions, rules the domain of the dead, the accounts of fate, the obligation of the living to remember ancestors. The three-way division is elegant and instructive. Each realm presents a moral economy that organizes human activity. Maritime trade under Poseidon's temper, civic law under Zeus's jurisdiction, debt and memory under Hades' watch. What this story functions to do: define roles. When people know who is in charge of what, they can expect patterns and make plans.
The myth codifies social functions so a community can, through worship and taboo, sustain order. Now, in this new age, the gods begin to fill out like living institutions. It is time for their portraits not as static catalog entries, but as condensed human-scaled archetypes. Each vignette below is a small lamp. It will make visible a particular way the ancient world turned experience into story. Zeus. Image him atop his throne, a mantle that needs tending, thunderbolt coiled like a promise. Zeal for justice and the grip of sovereignty live in him. Yet he is also a being of appetite and compromise. He breaks oaths and makes them. He can be generous and cruel depending on the exigency of the moment. What this portrait functions to do, Zeus self-consciously models rulership that must balance force and mediation. He personifies the paradox of statecraft, protector and predator. Hera. In some halls she is resplendent and regal, in others scornful and consumed by jealousy. Her power lies not only in punitive fury, but in the sanctity of marriage, kinship, familial contract. What this portrait functions to do, Hera enforces social bonds, particularly the rules that make households stable. She is a deity who guards oaths and punishes their breach, thereby sanctifying marriage as a public institution. Athena. Born fully formed from Zeus's head, she is the goddess of prudence, craft, and civic order. Her armor is not merely for battle. It is the symbol of strategy applied to cities, law, counsel, skilled artisanship. Her dispute with Arachne over weaving is less about vanity and more about the communal sense of craft as social memory. What this portrait functions to do, Athena legitimizes civic institutions and the intellect that sustains them. She models measured leadership and the idea that wisdom, not mere strength, secures a polis. Apollo. Luminous and ordered, Apollo guides the arts of prediction and the discipline of healing, but also the sharpness of archery. He is the god who gives name and measure to disease and song. His oracle at Delphi is a point where knowledge, prophecy, and politics meet. What this portrait functions to do, Apollo embodies the cultural desire for order in health and in social discourse. He makes disease nameable and the future, in part, interpretable. Artemis. Sister to Apollo, she is at once hunter and guardian of the thresholds that separate wild from domestic. She looks after childbirth and the wilderness with equal intensity. What this portrait functions to do, Artemis preserves boundaries between wilderness and settlement, between childhood and adulthood, and so establishes rites of passage and practices of reverence. Ares. The god of raw war, Ares is brash, quick to rage, and often outwitted by more calculating gods. He reveals an unvarnished truth. Violence is seductive and must be controlled or ritualized. What this portrait functions to do, Ares personifies the drive of martial valor and the need to channel it through civic institutions like the army and its codes. Aphrodite. Born of foam and wound, she personifies love, sexual attraction, and the tangled commerce of desire. Her power is social as much as personal. Alliances are brokered through marriage and desire. Cities are bound by alliances that often pass through the household. What this portrait functions to do, Aphrodite marks the social importance of attraction and alliance. She explains why love can be political and why beauty can be a lever in human affairs. Hephaestus. Exiled, lame, and brilliant, Hephaestus is the artisan who turns raw materials into technologies and ritual objects. His forge secures the practical infrastructure of the gods and humankind alike. What this portrait functions to do, Hephaestus elevates craft as a source of social order. Through him, artisanship gains honor and centrality. The production of tools becomes sacralized. Hermes. Fleet-footed and sly, Hermes is the messenger and the boundary crosser, patron of travelers, thieves, and markets alike. He carries messages between gods and men, between life and death in certain cults. What this portrait functions to do, Hermes models interchangeability and flexibility. He is the figure who makes trade and cultural exchange intelligible and ethically negotiable. Hestia. The quiet center, Hestia tends the hearth, the axis of communal life. Her presence sanctifies domestic peace and the continuity of home. What this portrait functions to do, Hestia institutionalizes the hearth as the social focal point and teaches the value of domestic stability in sustaining civic life. Demeter. As keeper of grain and the cycle of fertility, Demeter's moods literally shape the fields. Her catastrophic grief when Persephone is taken gives rise to the Eleusinian mysteries, rituals that teach how to live with loss and to honor the seasons. What this portrait functions to do, Demeter links agricultural practice to ritual so that survival is both technical and sacred. Her story instructs communities in rites that secure food and meaning. Persephone. Both a maiden and queen of the underworld, Persephone embodies the seasonal turn, absence and return. Her descent is the great myth that explains winter's barrenness and spring's return. What this portrait functions to do, Persephone provides a narrative for cyclical loss and regeneration and anchors rites of mourning and hope. Dionysus. God of vine and ecstasy, he embodies ritual release, the loosening of social strictures in controlled settings. His rites allow for sanctioned reversal, frenzy, and catharsis. What this portrait functions to do, Dionysus secures social order by permitting temporary disorder, the communal intoxication that renews bonds and outlets tensions. These are short portraits, but each performs a real cultural labor. They teach who is responsible for what is permissible, and what must remain taboo. They are social instruction manuals disguised as biography. Between portraits, we always return to smaller, mortal-centered tales, stories meant to be retold at hearthside, in the market, and beneath the shelter of temples. Some of these tales have already been named: Prometheus and Pandora, the theft of fire, the opening of the jar. Now we linger more on Demeter and Persephone, for their story is the one most intimately connected to the lived rhythms of agrarian communities. Imagine Demeter walking the earth in a low, dour light, harvests failing, mothers grieving. Imagine her flinging herself into the wilderness, searching for a child who has been taken into a subterranean marriage. The grief is public. There are no private seasons of sorrow in a farming community. Demeter's search becomes a public crisis. The fields refuse to grow. People must act. Who will they call? Who will keep a vigil? The myth answers with the Eleusinian mysteries, secret rites performed by initiates that promise, among other things, some measure of secured fertility and a ritualized method for grappling with loss. These rites are not taught as mere superstition. They are complex social practices, initiations, shared meals, oaths, and rituals that structure the community's responses to the vagaries of weather and life. What this story functions to do, the Demeter-Persephone myth sacralizes the agricultural cycle. It creates a social contract that says, when the earth grows stingy, we have rituals to renew it. When the child is lost, we have ways to grieve together. The ritual knowledge encoded in the myth is practical: times to sow, times to harvest, and existential, ways to survive sorrow. Prometheus and Pandora, in their turn, offer moral frameworks for innovation and suffering.
Prometheus's gift of fire is not only technological, it is a social accelerant. Fire cooks food, hardens tools, and empowers communities. It also threatens the status of gods who regulate how knowledge is shared. Prometheus's punishment dramatizes the danger innovators face and the social cost of redistributing power. Pandora's jar, with evil spilled and hope remained, offers a theology of human suffering that is neither cosmically punitive nor meaningless. Suffering exists, hope is stubbornly present. The myth instructs communities how to hold both truths. The world will bring burdens, and yet there is a capacity to sustain. What these stories function to do: they articulate a moral economy. They tell which innovations are dangerous, how suffering is to be interpreted, and how communities must ritualize both to continue. Ritual practice underpins most of these stories' endurance. The Eleusinian mysteries, sacrifices at the hearth, processions in spring, these are not marginal acts.
They are the daily maintenance of a culture's interpretive lens. Through them, myth is not only told but acted. The story of Zeus is repeated in kingship rituals, the story of Demeter in harvest rites, Dionysian reversal in festivals that temporarily upend social orders to relieve pressure. The rituals are the pragmatic arm of mythwork. They make abstract narrative into public habit. What all of these myths together function to do is to create a shared map, an interpretive lexicon that orients people in a world that is unsettling and often violent. Myths name storms, seasons, social roles, and the moral contours of life. They provide scenarios and precedents. When a mortal faced famine, bankruptcy, or a foreign invasion, the mythic archive supplied analogs. This has happened before in a different key. Through repetition and ritual, these narratives became cultural memory, repositories of adaptive responses. But myths are not only functionalist tools. They are also mirrors that allow psychological life to be given a shape. Archetypes emerge: the jealous spouse, the trickster benefactor, the mother whose sorrow reshapes the earth, the usurping child. These figures allow people to see themselves and others with less bewilderment. A man jealous of his wife's influence sees himself in Hera, a craftsman in Hephaestus, an inventor in Prometheus. Through recognition comes regulation. Communities learn to reward or curb behaviors according to repeatedly performed narratives. And yet, myths were not cold manuals. They were poetry. That poetry is the reason they travel so well across centuries. When you tell the story of Aphrodite rising from sea foam, it is at once a tale of beauty, of the social economy of marriage and alliances, and an image with ineffable pull. People remember metaphor even when they forget law. Why then are these not merely sleep stories? Because they are both mattress and map. They prepare a child for a world, teaching them who to revere, who to fear, how seasons turn, where power sits, and how to mourn. They let people sleep knowing which rites will come at dawn and what behavior will procure aid. They are not just entertainment. They are instruction manual, dictionary of emotions, and civic liturgy woven into one. The legacy of these myths is visible in the small scaffolding of every society. The language they provide: to pay a debt to Hades, to wear Athena's prudence, to light a hearth for Hestia, becomes idiom. The rituals become habits. Institutions acquire origin stories that bind them to sacred precedent. And the archetypes survive in poetry, in law, in the latest novels and films that still borrow the pattern of a jealous queen or a craftsman plagued by exile. The forms last because they are useful and because they answer recurrent human riddles. What this story functions to do in the modern imagination: it offers frameworks for meaning. When a community braces itself against uncertainty, against climate, disease, political upheaval, mythic patterns can help people narrate their fears and organize their responses. The motifs are portable. They migrate into psychotherapy, the idea of archetypes, into literature, the tragic hero, and into politics, the staged ritual of power transfer, always carrying the same sediment of human concern. There is a final truth that the myths keep repeating in their many variations. Power can build a world, but it cannot finally own it. Kings may thrust and gods may decree, but seasons change, the earth shakes, and death remains. The myths teach humility toward forces larger than any one order. That is perhaps their enduring moral, to teach humans to live under conditions of both wonder and limitation. As night draws its blanket closer and the telling softens, we return to a domestic image, one that will recast the stories in the very frame where they were often shared, the hearth. A child is tucked in. The tales of gods and monsters have been heard, but they are not simply to frighten, they are to instruct. They tell the child what to revere, how to bargain, how to suffer, and where to look for hope. The candle guttering, the parent's low voice, these are not trivial trappings, but practices that hand on cultural pattern. Think now, the thunderbolt that felled a titan is, in domestic scale, a rule enforced. The seed planted in the soil is, on human scale, a promise kept. Myths are the stories communities fall asleep with in their mouths. They are the final moral that consolidates a day's choices into a narrative, and so offers a shape to the self. They are not simply pretty stories, they are the scaffolds of meaning that people cling to when all else is uncertain. If the ancients had a practice we might learn from, it was this. They did not separate wonder from duty. The gods were beings to admire and to be wary of. They were templates for behavior and mirrors for the self. Myths taught both how to act and how to feel. They institutionalized memory, turned craft into sacral practice, and taught that grief and hope must be ritualized if social life is to continue. Tonight, when you close your eyes, and perhaps this listening was itself a nocturne, you may still hear in the quiet the echo of those forges and the low murmur of sacrificers at an altar. The sound is not archaic noise. It is the ongoing conversation between human communities and a world that will not stop exacting its terms. Myths remain because they continue to answer. What shall we fear? What shall we celebrate? And how shall we live? The stories may begin as lullabies, but they end as maps. They are not meant to be taken as literal history. They are meant to be read as lived truth, a way people made sense of storms, succession, love, invention, and loss. They helped ordinary people name the forces they felt beneath their feet and in their hearts. So, the next time you hear a tale of a god's jealousy, a titan's fall, or a maiden's descent, listen for more than narrative flourish. Listen for the grammar of civic life. Listen for the rituals that keep a society fed and sane. Listen for the psychological shape that lets individuals see themselves reflected in mythic patterns. That is the reality these stories encode, not empirical proof of divine events, but a durable architecture of meaning. If you want to follow the threads further, if you want a reading list, sources, and a deeper dive into the rituals and texts that shaped these tales, check the episode notes for recommended books and translations. And if this map of myth has opened something in you, subscribe for more explorations where stories are treated not as sleepy entertainments, but as the active tools by which people have always tried to hold the world together.